Hello, everyone. Welcome to One-on-One with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope you're making the most of your time at home, washing your hands, wearing your masks outside, and checking in on family and friends, and generally keeping busy. Our goal here is to bring you these conversations so that we don't make physical distancing turn into social isolation. Well, my guest today is my colleague, Eric Fusfield. Eric is our Director for Legislative Affairs and also the Deputy Director for B'nai B'rith's International Center for Human Rights and Public Policy. And in that position, deals with public policy issues, not only here in the United States, but abroad as well. Eric, thank you for joining us today.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So the topic today is a little bit different than the usual. We're going to be talking about a TV miniseries, The Plot Against America, which is on HBO. And The Plot Against America is based on a 2004 novel written by Philip Roth that is based in, of course, Washington, D.C., as we'll learn, but also in Newark, New Jersey. Newark is where Roth grew up. He went to Wequahic High School, and it's the Wequahic neighborhood that is the center of the plot in this six-part miniseries. This adaptation imagines that Charles Lindbergh, the iconic American hero, the man who flew across the Atlantic in 1927, became president in 1940, defeating Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And as a result, that led to widespread persecution of Jews in the United States. Why widespread persecution? Because Lindbergh, after his heroic flight across the Atlantic, in terms of politics, became very much an isolationist. He was a Nazi sympathizer, and he was the spokesman for the America First Committee, which was increasingly vocal as the rest of the world turned to World War II as the shadows of war approached. He was a man who had a lot of respect among many sectors of the American public, and his rhetoric, both in favor of Germany not going to war, not bringing the United States into war, and his anti-Semitism. He was a friend of Henry Ford, as we'll learn shortly, who was a notorious anti-Semite. All of this served as the groundwork, the basis for the Philip Roth book. Eric, before we start, let me just kind of set the table here in terms of Jews in America in 1940. There were about 4.7 million Jews in 1940 living in the United States. Almost half of them were living in New York City or its environs. It was a difficult time for Jews in America. The 1930s had, speaking of anti-Semites, Father Charles Coughlin, who was a radio broadcaster whose weekly broadcasts were filled with anti-Semitism. There was the German American Bund and other organizations like it that were pro-Nazi in their activity. In fact, the Bund would hold rallies at Madison Square Garden with thousands of people who would come. And so it was an uncertain time. Many of the 4.7 million Jews in America at that time were still immigrants. They had come not too long before that, or certainly their parents had come just a few short years before. So it was an important time for American Jews. The community was growing, and yet there were many who were concerned about what was going on around them with regard to anti-Semitism. One more note. I said that Roth is from Newark. Newark had a large Jewish population at that time. The Wequahic section of the city was heavily populated by Jews, and that serves as the centerpiece for this novel. So, Eric, let's pick it up from there. How does the book's treatment of this story differ from the HBO treatment?
Well, the miniseries is pretty faithful to the book. I think the filmmakers, this is the co-creators, David Simon and Ed Burns, have said that they wanted to amplify comparisons to current day events, but that's sort of muted in the story. I mean, mainly it's pretty faithful to the events of the story. It picks up in 1940 when Lindbergh is on his way to being elected president as the face, the spokesman of the anti-war movement. The winds of war are blowing in Europe, and Lindbergh is leading a movement to keep America out of war. He says it's either Lindbergh or war. That's his slogan. And in the book and in the miniseries, America chooses Lindbergh over war.
So this starts in 1940. The war, of course, has started in Europe in September 1939. There's a lot of pressure to enter, to back our, particularly at that particular point in time, to back our ally, Great Britain, the UK. And Roosevelt keeps us out until, of course, December 1941. So this really starts at an interesting point because we're not yet in the war, but we're moving in that direction. But stepping back away just for a minute to look at the broad picture, and then we'll get into the details. How much of this book, it's semi-autobiographical. Roth in 1940 is about 9 years old. So how much does this story, put broadly, tell us about Jewish identity in America at that point?
Well, it's really a fascinating commentary on Jewish identity in America because here you have this public debate over whether America should enter the war, and Jews are caught in the vortex. And the spectrum of reactions within the community to their predicament shows you different perceptions of Jewish identity at that time. For example, at the centerpiece of the story is a fictionalized version of Roth's parents, Herman and Bess Roth. In the book, they're Herman and Bess Levin. Sorry, in the miniseries, they're Herman and Bess Levin, but in the book, they're Herman and Bess Roth. And um, this resonates for me because my own grandparents were named Herman and Bessie, and they were the same generation. This is a generation, the first generation that grew up in the United States and felt, to a large extent, secure, comfortable in their Americanness. And when I think of my grandparents' apartment in the Bronx, the first thing I saw when I entered the doorway was a lithograph of George Washington on the wall. And this was a clear signal to me that my grandparents' statement was, "We belong here. We're American." And this is how Herman and Bess Levin in the story feel, but they express it in different ways. Herman is the picture several times. We're American. I'm not leaving. If the anti-Semites want their own country, they can go somewhere else. Bess is the picture of motherly warmth, but she's a pragmatist. And at some point, when violence or ugly rallies are breaking out in the streets and there are desecrations of Jewish cemeteries, she says, "Herman, it's time we think about moving to Canada. We can do it. We can pack our bags and leave." And then you have other characters who respond in other ways. The one that I'll mention who's of most significance is the character played by John Turturro. John Turturro is everyone's favorite non-Jewish Jewish actor because he was Barton Fink and Herbie Stemple. In this story, he's Rabbi Lionel Bengelsdorf. Rabbi Bengelsdorf is a Lindbergh acolyte, disciple, court Jew. He loves his access to President Lindbergh. He's proud of it. It feeds his ego. And he cooperates with Lindbergh in an effort to move Jews through legislation out of urban areas and into the countryside where they can mingle and assimilate with the wider population.
So Lindbergh has assembled a cabinet, an administration, which includes a number of anti-Semites, just to fill out the story. So his Secretary of Interior is Henry Ford. His vice president is Senator Burton Wheeler, I think of Wyoming, who also
Montana.
was a non-interventionist or an isolationist, and an anti-Semite as well. The program that the administration has, you said, is basically to separate Jews out, to send them, quote unquote, to the interior. And what are the characters doing at this particular time? They're coming from Newark. So they're forced to get on a train? Do they decide to stay? I mean, what happens to the family once these edicts are put in place by this anti-Jewish administration?
Well, we don't see the Levin family move to the countryside. They were planning to. Herman's job, the company that employs him, it's an insurance company, they're relocated to Kentucky. So the dilemma for him is either I keep my job and I move my family to Kentucky, or I quit. And after some debate, he decides to quit and work for his brother and stay in Newark. But he gathers together with other people in the community who are in the same predicament as he is. And they speak to their lawyer. They want to fight this. Of course, litigation takes time. And they're not junction. So either you quit your job now, maybe later on you can get your job back, but it's a very uncomfortable situation for them. Some families do move, and you see them get in their cars and drive away. And they make a new life for themselves in Kentucky or Montana, other parts of the country. And so the Levin family decides to stay and take a stand on principle. Other characters in the story take more extreme positions. Of note is the Levin's nephew, Alvin, who, when America decides not to enter the war, he leaves for Canada and enlists in the Canadian army to fight and says defiantly, I want to kill Nazis. So he's at one end of the spectrum, and at the other end of the spectrum is Rabbi Bengelsdorf, who's the ultimate appeaser and Lindbergh enabler.
Now, how does the story treat the, not a conundrum, but the issue that the Jews have always faced in this country, about feeling American and feeling Jewish? Now, in this story, Lindbergh comes along, and it's not just a hypothetical, where am I on the scale? It's choices have to be made, or choices are being made for me. How does Roth treat in the book, and how does the miniseries treat this dilemma of wanting to be American? I know both of my parents were immigrants, very proud of this country. The 4th of July, for example, was a very important holiday for Jewish immigrants. The idea of being in America and becoming an American was extremely important to these folks. Now, in the story comes 1940, a new administration headed by someone who is anti-Semitic, who is a sympathizer of Nazi Germany. In fact, I think in the story, I think that Lindbergh, on behalf of the United States, concludes some kind of non-aggression treaty, or some kind of pact with Nazi Germany that would keep us out of the war in Europe. But this very delicate balance of being American, being Jewish, how is it treated here?
Well, this is interesting, because this is the timeless dilemma that American Jews face. How Jewish can I be and still be as righteous indignation about his position, is the notion that he does not have to compromise his Jewishness in any way in order to be fully American. He loves this country. He feels he is as American as all of his Gentile neighbors, but he's also fully Jewish, and there's no conflict there. Whereas Bengelsdorf, in in playing or appealing to the Lindbergh forces, the nativist forces, says, well, yes, I'm a proud Jew as well, but what he's signaling in different ways is this notion that if we weren't just so Jewish, be more American that way. In other words, the idea is to the homestead legislation that this administration passes through Congress is to move Jews out of urban areas.
This is
And
like a second Homestead Act. The first Homestead Act was, of course, in the middle of the 19th century. So they call it. Do they call it a Homestead Act?
they call it Homestead 42, but this is much more sinister than the Homestead Acts of the 1800s, because the idea really is to break up Jewish ghettos in the Northeast. And in fact, you see one of the Levin's children, the teenager Sandy, is participates in a pilot program for this. It's a summer program called Just Folks for Jewish American kids. It farms them out to the countryside. I mean, literally, they spend the summer on farms so that they can live with non-Jewish families. And when his parents express discomfort with this, he says to them, this is probably the worst accusation he can make. You're ghetto Jews. You're living in this pocket, and you don't understand how, he doesn't put it in exactly these words as a teenager, but his message is, you're so insulated and isolated. And he feels that they should mix with the populace. And this is what Bengelsdorf is trying to do. In other words, it's okay to be Jewish. It's good to be Jewish. Just don't be so Jewish. And so this is the strain of thinking in the American Jewish community that Roth, that the author is trying, and the filmmakers are trying to give voice to through those characters.
Now, I want to get back to Roth in a second, but what happens to Lindbergh here midway into his term? He serves out the 4 years?
Well, so he's elected president. He takes office, and what we've seen so far. The finale airs April 20th, but what we see in the prior episodes is that he forms a friendly alliance with the Nazi regime, and he keeps America out of the war, and he invites. He invites Hermann Goering to the White House for a reception, and Bengelsdorf and his wife Evelyn are invited to this reception as the token Jewish representatives. They're told that they're there to represent their people, and they're flattered to be there. And we see Evelyn even dancing with Goering at this reception. So this is the impression that we're left with. We don't see, the focus is more neighbors than it is on Lindbergh, but Lindbergh is always the backdrop. And he has his enablers, he has his appeasers, and they tolerate the fact that he has this relationship with the Nazis.
Well, let's talk finally about Roth. The reason for writing this book. It's so different than almost everything else he's written. Of course, many of his books, almost all of his books, deal with Jewish subjects, with Jewishness, with this conflict that he himself had, it seems, this dilemma of who am I? There was an identity issue. Now, he must have remembered, even though he was 9, 10 years old when this was happening, it must reflect in some way a continuing concern that he had at that very intense moment in Jewish history and in American history. because of the rise of Hitler, World War II, the place of Jews who at that point were growing but still somewhat powerless, really, until the State of Israel came along in 1948. I mean, all of the things that we know and we've discussed many times. So what do you think his intention here was in writing this book and ultimately in HBO picking this up and having the miniseries air?
Yeah, well, I think that Philip Roth writing this book in 2004 speaks to the timelessness of these issues, these dilemmas that you and I are discussing now. In other words, what he saw what the country experienced in 1940, even though the reality was a different one than the fictionalized version we see in the book and the miniseries. But he saw what American Jewish life was like in 1940. He knew how they felt about their Jewishness and so forth. But he felt that some of the dilemmas that they faced in 1940 were still present in 2004. And the filmmakers would tell you they're still present in 2020. In other words, the kind of nativist forces that the book and the miniseries describe, they've always been present in American society. They may speak with a louder voice at some points, but they were there then, they're with us today. Another thing that comes to mind is the fact that in moments of crisis, Jews and other minorities are especially vulnerable. Now, this was true when there was a public debate over America entering World War II in 1940. When Roth wrote his book, it was in the early years post 9/11. And America, for understandable reasons, was adopting stricter homeland security measures. And he may have wondered how the new post 9/11 reality would impact the Jewish community and other minorities. The filmmakers today, they'll tell you, because they do interviews, they'll look at events like Charlottesville, the neo-Nazi rally 3 years ago, and a rise in hate crimes the last couple of years. And they'll say, again, these nativist forces, white supremacist forces, they're still out there. They're still part of the culture. And it's still a domestic threat that our community faces.
Okay, well, before we conclude, just a footnote perhaps on Lindbergh himself. When Pearl Harbor occurred on December 7th, 1941, Lindbergh pulled back from his non-interventionist stance, and later, I think, went on during the war to hold some position in our Air Force. But the truth of the matter is that for all of the years following, he could not shed, and I think justifiably so, he could not shed the mark against him for having been a sympathizer of Nazi Germany, for saying that we should go easy on Germany and harder on the Soviet Union, for his going to Berlin and receiving a state decoration from Hermann Goering, who was the head of the Nazi Air Force, as you've just said. So it's I think, a permanent mark on the man. And even though time has passed, and I would say that most Americans probably who don't follow these things probably don't remember the name Lindbergh in any case, although it certainly was one of the most important events in our history, the flight across the Atlantic, but certainly about his activity in those very important years leading up to World War II.
Yeah, I think this touches on something very interesting that happens in the miniseries. Rabbi Bengelsdorf, the John Tortora character, like I said, he's an appeaser. He's going along with the America First committee, the isolationists, because he thinks in a way this will benefit the Jews. It'll help them really integrate more into the country. But there are moments where he sits there. He sits in a room with Vice President Wheeler, with Henry Ford, and he hears them talk about what this will do for the Jews. And he realizes it's kind of a whoa moment for him. He realizes they are taking this further than I would have wanted. In other words, it's a signal of what can happen when you dance greater than you would anticipate. And it's an interesting revelation for him because there are moments where Rabbi Bengelsdorf and others say, well, of course, I in no way approve of all of the Nazis' policies. However, I believe in the US-German alliance and so forth. So it's a moment of sober recognition for people who walk down this path and then realize it's taking them further than they wanted to go.
Well, it certainly sounds like interesting viewing. Eric, thank you for joining us today and having this conversation about the HBO miniseries, The Plot Against America. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to One-on-One with B'nai B'rith International. Please visit our website, b'naibrith.org, like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. And lastly, be sure to tell a friend about us. For my colleague, Eric Fusfield, I'm Dan Mariaschin. We'll talk to you next time on B'nai B'rith One-on-One. Take care, everyone.